Welcome, everyone, to a special edition of Drunk Agile. We'll get to why it's so special in a second, but if you're watching, you can probably see why it's so special. But let's do some introductions first. With me, as always, unfortunately, we have Prateek Singh, but even better yet, we have a birthday girl, right? It's her birthday today.
Yeah, it's Nisha's birthday.
Yeah, it's like
Nisha, yeah, she's like, whatever.
It's so tough being beautiful. So tough being beautiful, I know. But the reason this is so special is we have a guest that we've been trying to get on the show for, I think, like literally months. And he's been dodging us, rightfully so.
No, yeah. I mean, you guys are too busy, and
yeah.
So Chris McDermott, welcome, Chris.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Couple things about Chris. So Chris was involved with the Kanban community very, very, very early on. I mean, I think you're essentially the one who kind of brought Kanban to Scotland. Way back when Chris started, I would argue, the world's best Kanban conference. We won't necessarily talk about what's happened since then, but at the time it was widely regarded as probably the destination conference. If you wanted to learn about Lean and Kanban stuff, you went to Lean Agile Scotland, which hopefully everybody knows was started by Chris here. So Chris, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm a avid watcher of Drunk Agile. I'm an avid drinker.
I'm avidly drunk and avidly agile.
Anything that has to do with drinking. So Chris, since you're our guest, what are you drinking? What do you have?
So I have Tamdu. So I'm drinking. Now, I promised Dan, if I was to come on, I would also bring with me another drink, which is famous in Scotland, because I'm not a great whiskey drinker. I do enjoy whiskey, but I don't tend to have a lot of it in the house. Actually, I was up speaking to my dad, who lives close by, mum and dad, and I said, I'm going on this podcast, and they drink whiskey, and I don't drink much whiskey. I don't have much in the house. He says, go and take a bottle from the cupboard. I went, okay, so I stole from my dad. But on the way home, I promised Dan I would bring another one of Scotland's really famous drinks, or certainly it's drunk in Scotland, or famously drunk in Scotland, and it's not Iron Brew. It's Buckfast tonic wine, highly caffeinated tonic wine, drank by the youngsters. I think that's their favorite drink of an evening.
So that's a whole Scotland thing. I thought that was just kind of a West Coast Glasgow thing. Is that? But it's all of Scotland, or
it's probably West Coast. Probably Glasgow thing. I think it's also popular in Northern Ireland. But, probably not so popular where it's made in Devon. That's more of a cider part of the world.
Right. Okay, so you have to have a glass of Buckfast on air then. At some point. Is that bottle even open? It's
no. It's like, no, that's not going anywhere near.
It's empty. Prateek, what about you? What do you got for us?
I went back to the weather, back to the well, weather foolproof. It's getting really low, so I'm looking for some friends to send me some. But
friends who've been in Scotland recently who should have.
Well, we were just talking before we went online. There may or may not be a bottle here for Prateek. I'm not sure it's actually going to make it to Prateek's place. But,
does it matter if there's whiskey in it? Is that
all I said was a bottle. All I said
is a bottle. Here it is.
Yeah.
I'm back to the Blair Athol 12. So it's it doesn't look like it, but this is really one of my favorites. So I only save it for special occasions, which is I'm breaking it out for this special occasion. So Chris, again, thank you so much for joining us. If I can hand it off to you, can you introduce our topic and tell us what we're talking about tonight?
So there's a technique that myself and a good friend Mark Bergower, who also played a huge part in Lean Agile Scotland from the outset, helped a lot in sort of organising and sort of getting speakers. And it's a technique called change mapping. We had previously called it maturity mapping for a little while, but we kind of went off that name. It had some connotations that we didn't really enjoy, and it kind of closed the context down a little bit for us. So we've kind of moved on to call it change mapping, and it's a technique we use in our work in a day-to-day basis almost, to help us understand contexts, to help us understand how teams and organizations work in order to help make the right decisions for improvement. So it helps us analyze practices. What are the things they do, teams do, an organization does on a day-to-day basis to get the work done? And if it wants to improve flow, or if it wants to improve quality, we can look at the practices and say, what of these practices do we need to start to change? It's an idea we've been sort of playing with, I think, since about 2018. I was coaching a couple of teams in a public sector organisation here in Scotland, and I kind of got the opportunity to sort of take on a leadership role across the coaching community, and there's maybe, I don't know, 15, 16, 17 teams. And I started to think, how am I going to get the context with these teams? It's easy when you're in a team to look around you and understand the context. It's even easier when you've got a Kanban board and you can visualize the work and you can see the flow and you say, okay, I can understand what's going on here. But when you're not in teams and you're having to make decisions about how to help teams and how to sort of focus efforts and sometimes deploy sort of coaches and deploy support to teams, you need context. So I had at WLE Agile Scotland, we had invited along Simon Wardley, and he has over the last maybe 10 or 12 years developed a technique which he called Wardley Maps. He kind of, he spent ages thinking of that name, clearly. But the thing about Wardley Maps is they are designed for strategy, and they look at predominantly sort of technology and material things within organizations, the tools they use. And it's not just that, but it predominantly looks like that. So we kind of decided we would put a practice lens on it. Well, what do people do as opposed to what they use? So we started using it to create a visualization. Here are all the practices that teams use and how well developed are these practices. This took us down the sort of, which is a nice rabbit hole of social practice theory and understanding how theorists consider practice. What is a practice? What constitutes a practice? And then this kind of helped us to understand a little bit better about the kinds of things we can focus on when it comes to change. It kind of plays, for me, it plays nicely into obviously context, but it rubs against one of the things I think I hear Agilists talk about all the time, is we have to change their mindset. We must have a better mindset, and mindset being this thing that Agile is about. When people don't really change things by changing their mindset, they don't change what they do. You have to change the practices and the things they do on a day-to-day basis. So in a nutshell, that's what it is. It's about creating visualizations that help us see how work is done, and then using that to inform us how to change and how to improve.
That's what I read. That last point is kind of really something I wanted to pull on, because I think I've seen all of 2 presentations on Wardley Mapping. So of course I'm an expert, right? I know everything there is to know about Wardley Mapping. And I have to, this is going to surprise our viewership, but what little investigation I've done of Wardley Mapping, I've always been, skeptical. I'm like, why? So explain to me why Wardley Mapping in what you talk about? Why that technique as opposed to, say, something else? What is there something about that that is key, or is it was? I don't know. You tell me.
The technique was kind of the spark. So it was being able to see all of the things together. So the spark. Funnily enough, the whiskey I'm drinking tonight that I've gone and bothered from my father's house is the one my brother bought him and takes to the house. And every time my brother's there, he will have a glass of this whiskey. So he's clearly going to be very happy with the fact that it will go down a little bit. Or maybe he won't even return. But anyway, It was this brother who, Andy, who was at WLE Agile Scotland, and Simon Wardley gave his presentation, and he said, he's really good speaker. That was really interesting. So I will never use that. I will never use that technique because I am not in the boardroom and I will never be part of a conversation about strategy. So I think this kind of just sat in the back of my mind. And when I start to like, how can I see, how can I visualize, how can I understand what teams do? That's when it sort of came to sort of the fore for me. What we do is not necessarily Wardley mapping. So Wardley mapping suggests that a component, a thing, well, like a tool, I don't know, let's say content management systems, for example. Don't know why I choose that one, but let's go with that one. They've had a life cycle, an evolutionary life cycle, a point in time where they are a pure concept. People don't really do content online, but then they start to become something that people are interested in. He calls that Genesis. And then from Genesis, they move into a phase called custom build, so that people go, oh, this is an interesting thing, but they all do it differently themselves. They all take a different approach to it. So you see a whole number of variants. Think of it like JavaScript frameworks. Like every time you look at the web, there's another, JavaScript frameworks are bound to always stay in custom build. Somebody's always going to come up with another one. But then what happens is when the people can recognize they can make money from these things, they then get drawn further right on a Wardley map into a space called product utility. And that is where people are saying, okay, we can start to take these features and build a company one, and we'll sell it to you. So instead of your developers building a new one every single time, or using one that you have built in-house, a company will build one and sell you one as a service. And then the final stage is when it becomes a commodity. And that is when it's so highly used, it's used everywhere, that you'll find 2 or 3 different vendors for them. And basically they are just fighting over the smallest feature differences. Everyone knows exactly what content management's about, exactly why they need it. So the sort of highly commoditized, you can get them anywhere. And the margins for selling content management is like tiny now. You know, it's so routine. So if we think about that in the lens of practices, if you take a kind of similar path, you can think about how practice emerges in organizations as a concept. So if we change the label slightly, it's conceptual. It's like, okay, I've heard of this. This might be interesting. We'll try it out. Then what will happen is it goes into the next phase. The second of the 4 phases is emerging, where it's something where people will, okay, well, now we can get value from this. We've done some experimenting, and now that maybe starts to fragment, or what you find is maybe there's no steady routine in how it's done. There's no established routine. And then it transitions into what was product from the material sense into good in the practice sense, where you're starting to say, okay, there is routine, but there's definitely opportunity for improvement. And then you have this space of best practice. Best practice, I think it's important to say that best practice isn't something we're saying is globally best practice. It's contextually best practice. It's what's best practice for that team right now and how well routine things are. So the visualization helps us do that. It also helps us consider how practices link together. What are the relationship between practices? How does information flow between the different things? So if you think of a team, the information or maybe flows through the concept of a story. How does the story flow through the practices of the developer will work on and the tester will work on and the analyst and so on? So it allows us to create a network that shows all of the flows of information or the relationships between practices. So this is also really interesting, because if you start to see practices with multiple relationships, you can go, this is like a really cornerstone practice that a team has. And if it's not really good, if it's to the left-hand side of our maps, you can say, maybe this is what we should focus on to improve the situation. And finally, or maybe finally,
we've only got 20 minutes, Chris.
Well, yeah.
Okay. The part, like, I love the concept of value streams and value stream mapping and understanding things through value streams, but we know work doesn't go in the stream and doesn't go in one direction. There's loops and there's connections and flows backwards and forwards. So this kind of what we could describe as value networks is practices in a network that deliver value for a customer or for an organization.
I've got several more questions. Prateek, you want to jump in with something?
Yeah. I thank you for explaining the stages of that, because I was trying to figure out how does this map? How does the map? The immediate question I had was, when we're moving from left to right in this map, let's say whatever practice, limiting WIP, whatever that practice is it more about adoption of the practice, or is it more about deepening of the practice? This thing, we're doing this better than we used to.
That's a great question. So what we ask when we are wanting to position a practice on a map is, what does good look like to you? So because we're concerned about the context and what matters in that context, and also what people know, we ask that question: what does good look like to you? And good to us is routine. It's just that, like, do we do it on a regular basis? So that gives us the kind of X, the sort of horizontal axis. What we also start to think about is how many people know this. So if we have on our Y-axis, it's visibility. So at the top, we position the need, like, what is this? Why is this team here? What is it here to do? There's the need at the top. And then the further up the Y-axis the practice goes, the more people are aware of it, the more people are doing it, more sort of volume, as you said, there is to the practice. So movement and improvement for us might be move to the right to get it more routine and better, well established, and also could be move upward to make it more visible, more people aware. So if you imagine right at the bottom of the Y-axis, it's maybe there's somebody in our team who's brilliant at that. No idea how they do it. Right, so but we want to know. So our movement, our improvement we want to make is go up the way. We want more people involved.
Okay, but that's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because if we talk about, like, say, story points, right? Story points, high visibility, everybody's doing it, right? I mean, wouldn't story points be like for like a typical Scrum team? Not the story points is in Scrum before I start getting hate mail.
Again,
every week it's something new. Wouldn't story points be something that's really far to the right and really far high? And that I would argue that's not necessarily a good thing. Right. Yep. So how do we put a filter on that?
So there's two aspects to this, or two things to think about here. One is why do we do story points? What is the purpose? So I think about.
I hope that's rhetorical.
No. There's a reason why people do it. It's not necessarily the practices. Well, I won't go down your rabbit hole, and I don't get hate mail. I don't want to get hate mail.
It's like I see this as a trap. I see this as a trap.
It is. I have my up here somewhere. I have my story point cards deck, and they are brilliant when you've got a wonky table. So if you can just put them in to keep everything level, they're great. So I don't want hate mail either, right? Story points are valuable. So so the thing about practices, and we think about practices, and this kind of the practices that we map, we use a framing called social practice theory to sort of describe a practice. And that means that's three things. It's three elements and three elements to integrate to make the practice. So those three elements are meaning, which is like a purpose. Why bother? Why are we doing this? Competence, your skill and able to do it, and the materials, the tools you use to do it. Right. So there's one lens you could look at this and say, why are you doing story points? Like, what do you aim to get from doing story points? And we could be like, well, we're trying to get better, estimate our work and understand how long it's going to take us, or maybe how complex it is, whatever that's for. But the meanings can be analysed and external, like, so you can look at a map as a coach and say, they're really good at story points, like they all say 5 all the time. That's so routine. But they're not really getting the value or the meaning. They're not sort of delivering on the meaning of that practice, which is to understand how long things will take. When will it be done? So as an external looking at a team, you can say, here, this practice that you're really good at is not fit for the outcome you're trying to achieve. Let's see how we can change that practice and compete, bring in a new practice onto a practice landscape and say, how can we compete with this one? So it does. So people can't magically understand all the options, all the practices available in the world that help them do things. They can only really understand their own context. So external perspective, the map helps bring up these external perspective, create an opportunity from someone else to look at and say, right, how do you do these things? Let's have a conversation. That's what really all these things are about, right? It's like we move a card on a board to break a WIP limit. Like, what are you going to do? You're going to have a conversation. You're going to help make a decision. So that's kind of, I guess that's the way we can see that.
There's an interesting other lens on this, which as you were describing it, I'm getting. It's just, if your map is too dense, you might want to start removing stuff.
There's a whip limit to practices. Yeah.
There's a whip limit to practices. Yeah. Start removing stuff, possibly, instead of just trying to figure out how to move the stuff forward or upwards, whatever that is. If you're too dense, it probably requires you to remove some of this stuff.
So there's two, again, yes, you could be looking at these things and say, whoa, you've got like 6 practices that all do the same thing for you. Could we try and create some standard or routine practice around that, which is great. But you can also maybe look at it, it's like a map, right? So you can zoom out and you can say, like, how can we cluster these practices into something else we could consider as a practice but a higher level? So the example I always think of here is driving as a practice. It has meanings, like I'm going from A to B, use competence, right? You need to know how to maneuver the car, and materials. You need a car, you need a road, you need those things. But braking is also a practice, and checking the mirror is also a practice. And in my country, changing the gear is also a practice that people do. But you guys, I know you guys don't do that.
I don't know what you're talking about. Actually, you don't do that either anymore. So
yeah.
I still know how, though. I still know how. So to the I can't see the wood from the trees type, look at all these practices. There's something really interesting in there to say, we're doing the same thing in multiple different ways. We're calling it different things. So you can, like, how do we try and create one practice that helps us develop more routine within a team? Or it's like, well, those are all different practices in the same space. You might look, oh, they're all development practices. We don't really care about talking about the development practices right now. Let's just bundle them up into one, and then we could maybe zoom in at a later point and see all of those.
Yeah, my mind just, I don't know, it's stuck on it. I would just keep going to, how do I remove practices? Because I always feel like you make processes better by removing stuff. So that's where I keep going with this, because I think that's it can give you an overview of, you've got 50 things going on. And that's what's getting in your way of actually running a smooth system.
Oh, yeah, exactly. So you can look at it and say, like, well, let's analyze the flow, right? We look at the team and the flow and then go, okay, things are really slow here. Why is that? Let's go and look at what we do. You do all that. You know, you could have practices that the team do that are like, oh, let's take that off this team and bundle up and put it in a platform that the team can consume, so that they don't have the cognitive load of all of this stuff they're trying to do.
Well, I mean, that was the last time we talked, Chris. I mean, that was kind of the light bulb for me, was because this was a debate that Prateek and I and Julia Wester were having on Slack the other day, is, you know, a bunch of practices, when we put a Kanban lens on this, right? A bunch of practices does not make a workflow, right? You know, and so it's like, how do you map these practices to the life cycle of taking something that's an idea and turning it into something that's tangible, for your customers? And I think a lot of people think that's trivial, and let's just put up our practices that we do. Like you said, we develop it, then we test it, and then we validate it, whatever. But that's really not what workflow is. And so what I was really, and you saw when I was pulling our conversation along those lines, is like, what was really interesting to me is how can we look at what a team's doing and map that more to what the life cycle of a work item is, so the team can really understand what practices are really helping them to deliver value to their customers versus what practices aren't. I don't know if you want to say a little bit about that, but Prateek was wrong, by the way, just saying, in case anybody's wondering. In that debate, I won that debate.
I think Julia will decide that, and I'm talking to her tomorrow morning, so I'll find out.
Yeah. So I used to design Kanban boards in the same way, but like, tell them what do you do? You're a developer. What do you do? You're an analyst. Okay, who starts? Who's next? Okay, there's the Kanban board. I think for me, like, if you put a practice lens on it, it's the question you're asking is, how does the work flow? So you can dive in, and so an analyst might have, or the practice of an analysis may have many different practices that sit in there. So start to understand them. You might start to see where there's an overlap between the thing a developer does and the thing an analyst does. So maybe that might help us say, okay, there's a boundary here that sits between these two roles with these collections of practices or networks of practices. Maybe that's a really interesting thing for us to visualize, like this work is at that boundary. Maybe that's something where we should focus, what the boundary points between the people and the teams and the different roles, but over looking through the practice lens. Yeah. So I think the thing is, depends how deep you want to go with this. It can be something you can really just keep digging and really understand to the nth degree. I think it's just about finding that right level for you, back to the how many do you want to see to make those kinds of decisions.
Yeah, but because I think one of the early points you made was that the life cycle of a work item is not, strictly speaking, is not linear, right? It's a network, right? It goes forward, it goes backward, it gets split up, it comes together, right? All these things happen. But what Prateek and I talk a lot about is, while we recognize there is that quote unquote complexity under the covers, there is a way of abstracting your understanding of that stuff such that it does look linear, right? I mean, just because you have to do just because on our board it says do A and then do B doesn't mean you can't start B before you've done A, things like that. And so that's why I think it's kind of interesting to use this technique for teams to understand how does work, because that's really what's going to help us to optimize flow. And of course, I'm biased. I think that's what it's all about, is how do we get to actually optimizing flow. But I think you're taking it to the next level, because you're potentially talking about organizational design and development, potentially around how do we change our organizational structure essentially to meet flow, which I think is really kind of where we want to take this thing. But
yeah, I think there's a couple of ways to look at flow outside the team. How does the workflow from throughout an organization? Yeah, the ways you can start to think about that is, you can think about it as like, well, let's take these bundles, we'll call them teams, all these bundles of practices, we'll call them a team, and we'll hide all the practices there. But then this team, the work from this team goes to this team, and like, what's the thing in the middle here? What is it that helps it transition? So these boundary practices are things you really want to look at. This is if you've got, like, I don't know, sort of set collections or teams of teams where there is a network that workflows. But if you're in that kind of, I don't know, it's been a while since I worked with software teams now, but if you're in that position where you're saying, oh, it's like traditional functions that BAs, business analysts are there, and developers are there, that kind of thing about looking at those practices, you can start to say, well, what practices do we actually need to bring together into teams to help workflow? What are the things they need to be able to do together? And then you can also look at who are our practitioners who can do these practices, and then sort of form and do that organizational change, organizational design that way.
There
was one other thing I wanted to pull on, Prateek. I don't know, but I want to give you an opportunity to get in here, though.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about what I'm seeing. A lot of this helps me visualize what my landscape looks like, what my practice landscape looks like. This is probably my fault. Every time I visualize something, I want to optimize it. I don't think there is within the map a thing to say optimize this. That comes from the outside. We want to optimize for this. Here is the landscape. Now use that lens to figure out what you need to change here. Is that correct?
Yep. There's nothing on, there's the map will bias you to decisions. If you just look and go, what should I do differently? Well, the things on the left, you want to move to the right. That's maybe not the right thing. You do want, you want to have a lens to look at it. What do we need to do in order to make the workflow? And it might be your practice on the left-hand side can stay on the left-hand side because you don't care about it. But it's the practices in the middle, and maybe the relationship between the practices is not right. Those are the things that will sort of improve the whole context, improve the whole team, or improve the flow for the whole team, which we know will improve everything else, because flow does that and makes everything better.
It's magic. I guess I did have two things. So Chris had mentioned before we started recording, Chris had mentioned he was doing a whole bunch of homework because he'd never really seen the Drunk Agile.
I
podcast before.
I don't think he ever got past the drunk part.
Yeah.
No, that's it. So, okay.
Wait, I have to watch.
This is a great 2-minute podcast thing you guys do. What are you drinking? Brilliant. I'll go do that.
But you had mentioned there are a couple things that we covered recently that potentially might be relevant here. Have we talked about those things, or was there something else that you wanted to mention?
There's one I picked up on team size.
Okay, good. Now Prateek perks up.
Yeah. So, like I don't want to get your hate mail. Don't redirect your hate mail to me, right? But this pizza size thing, and like this, for me, that's context free, right? That bothers me about it. It might be right, but it also might be wrong, right? But it is context free. I guess that's the thing that really bothers me about the team size thing. They also talked with Colleen about retro frequency. Do them every 2 weeks. Why? Why not every 2 days? Every 2 months? Yeah. It's about, for me,
or just in time, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I mean, I think you talked, was it Frank that had Frank Vega? Who you're talking about that had the Kanban board, the board that went 3 tickets and we'll go have a retro.
Yeah, that was Frank. Yeah,
that was one of my favorites. I used to do that as well because it was great. Yeah. And you found that after like a week, you'd had 3 retros, and then after a month, you'd had none. Yeah, because there's nothing to talk about. So the context there, I think, is really important, because, like I said, sometimes 7 people in a team's just perfect, and another time it's just suboptimal. It ruins the whole flow in an organization. So looking at the wider practice context there, you can see, well, what is it the organization is trying to do, or the people within this function are trying to deliver? How do we bring together the right practices to get that done? And I said, you talked about the first Kanban team was 60 people or something like that.
Ish, yeah.
You're optimizing for, sort of get small teams. You're optimizing for bottlenecks elsewhere, right?
Right. You're optimizing for dependencies. You're optimizing for managing dependencies, essentially.
Yeah. It's when you were describing Wardley maps earlier, it kind of, that's what's happened with that advice, is it's become commodity. It's this is just the advice. This is what we do.
Yeah.
As opposed to what you're talking about, where let's take this practice and look at it in the context of what we're trying to do. And I think that distinction between what you were talking about with Wardley map and what you're talking about with change mapping speaks to me a lot more of, in the context of our world, what does this practice look like? Team size is a practice, absolutely. And what does it look like?
Yeah. I happily receive hate mail and safe, right? Things like that. It is a complete context-free approach to, and it's not complexity informed either. It doesn't understand complexity. It's like, just put another set of practices in. We don't care what they're actually doing, because everybody needs, I don't know, Lean UX and DevOps, and just make them do all of that.
And WSGIF, right? That's not really,
Go change map safe. That might take a few years.
Yeah. The final, I think the final thing, we'll probably wrap up here, but we reserve the right to call you back for other questions, Chris. But there was something fascinating you said in the lead-in, right at the end, and you kind of said it under your breath. And I'd love for you to say more, because I think there's some gold here. You said people don't change by changing their mindset; they change by changing their practices. Say some more about that, because I think that's brilliant. So I know this is being recorded, but can you say some more about that?
So I often, the presentation I've been doing for the last 6 months or so, I bring up the Agile Manifesto, and I said there's the most important line in the Agile Manifesto is we're constantly improving things by doing it and helping others do it. Yeah. And then I highlight 2 words, and the 2 words are doing and do. Right? And then to say that line, like, nobody ever changed by changing mind. The only way things have changed is by a sustained change in practice, change in what people do. So the thing that bothers me about it is there's a couple of things. One is the way it's often framed is, people like me, or people with the same job title I have, if they go in and say they need to change their mindset, all of them need to change their mindset. Then when we've done that, then everything's going to be great. And there's the what's othering, and it's like, no, like you need to understand the context first in order to help. But also, if you know, I think how people think about work is important. I'm not diminishing that, but I think also with the practice lens, you also have to think about, well, what skills do the people who are doing the practices have in the work? So you can change their mind if they want, but they might not have the right level of skill. They're not being taught the right things, might not understand the right things. And also ultimately they might be constrained by the tools they're working with, whether that's the software people are building or the tools in which they use to build the software. So I think there's by just changing your mindset, you aren't going to sort of change that context. The other thing I think as well is with the agile mindset thing is like, I don't know how many developers that I've worked with or testers or people in different contexts who really just don't care about agile. They just want to go on and do their work. And if you can help them do their work better, then that's all that matters. And if it means like, you know, let's think a little bit about, you know, uncertainty in the work. It's a complex thing. Let me help you with practices that will help you deal with that. Then that's, but not, you know, you need to switch your mindset. I hate that word. It's like your mind is set and it's wrong, so we need to reset it the right way. Yeah. All right. That I think it's more of a frustration that bubbles under than one I can clearly articulate and clearly take the science for. But yeah, it's
I think because I think I was thinking about. I mean, I wasn't thinking about it exactly like that, but I was thinking about something similar recently. Is it's even better when necessity demands a change in practices. So, for example, pre-pandemic, every agile coach said agile's all about small co-located teams. Can't do agile remote. Can't do it.
And sticky notes.
Yeah. You know, pandemic hits and guess how quickly people figured out to work remotely, right? You know, and so that's, to me, that's kind of the essence of what you're talking about here. And it's, you know, I've been thinking about how do we create that sense of, you know, necessity, you know, around like limiting WIP, you know, around like things like paying attention to age, you know, things that Prateek and I talk about, is because, you know, there's such a big disconnect between when a decision is made and when there's actually a consequence of that decision, that people don't really see how these practices, you know, can help them. So there has to be some, I don't know, like I said, if the context could change so there's a necessity for that, that you could really see the impact of the decision that you're making. I don't have an answer for that. It's just something I've been, you know, been thinking about a lot lately.
I think that is that's an answer that depends on where you are in, you know, what organization you're in and the challenges they face. It's like the gap between the decision and the impact of the gap between the decision. Like it's my favorite, like, if I know you want to wrap up, my favorite story in the whole, like, where people changed how they thought about work, it would be probably, you know, the NUMI story, don't you? New United Motor Manufacturing. You know, don't know the NUMI story?
Please.
Cool.
Please go for it.
Should we? We kind of feel like we should. I don't know.
I don't know. Like, I've told it so many times, I've just figured I've ever spoken to my life. I said, I'm sure my mum heard that. So NUMI is the story of a collaboration between Toyota and GM.
Now I know that one. Yeah,
the Fremont manufacturing one. So Dan doesn't know. Right, I'll tell. GM Fremont was like the worst manufacturing plant in the US, or it's certainly the worst car manufacturing plant. Quality was awful. So basically GM said, we're going to shut this down. Right, so they closed the factory down, they sacked everyone. Everyone was laid off. And at the same time, there was legislation going through the US legislative processes that said we need to reduce fuel emissions. And this is like the late 70s, early 80s. And we're going to increase import levies because like Japanese manufacturing is killing us. So Toyota need to come to America to manufacture, and GM are like, we just can't build a small car. So they get together and they decide they're going to work in this factory together. So they decide that Fremont was free, so they don't have to build a new factory. They'll use Fremont. And for whatever reason, you can maybe look into this, 85% of the workforce that worked in Fremont ended up working at NUMI, this collaboration between Toyota and GM. And the factory went from having the worst quality cars, and within a 3-month period of being open as NUMI, had the best quality cars. Now, what had changed was not a mindset. There was 2 key factors that changed there. One was the purpose of work changed. So the manager said the purpose is different. Now, the purpose isn't quantity, the purpose is quality. So that started to thread through the practices. In order to facilitate quality, they introduced a new practice called the and-on cord. You pull the and-on cord, we stop to look at quality. And that was in essence it. There was other practices about, some continuous improvement practices, but that was in essence what changed the whole thing. There was no mindset change. The same people worked there. The same people did the work. What they just were given different opportunities and asked different questions. So it's a fascinating story. I like it. I hope I've told it well enough. Prateek, was that about right?
Yeah, I think it goes even further, but because I think they did a documentary on this thing. I never watched it, but that's how I know of it. I saw like the ads for it, and then I went and read up on it a little bit. But yeah,
there's the This American Life podcast on it, which is pretty good. But yeah, I think for me, the way I look at it is the new practice and the and-on cord and the meanings of the practices were changed by the leadership.
But was that and-on cord mandated? I mean, was it like, does somebody from on high say we are going to implement this? Because that's kind of what I'm talking about. Is somebody somewhere had to say we're doing this, and it was out of necessity that this practice, got put in place. That's what I'm saying. I think for me, that's much more powerful than the whole mindset. Let's When you've got them by the balls, their hearts and minds will follow. Yeah.
So more hate mail coming our way on, just tell people what to do.
Well, I put in random movie quotes. So if anybody can tell me what movie that's from, you'll win a mention on our next Drunk Agile episode. Chris, as our guest, the guest always gets the last word. Is there anything you'd like to say to wrap us up before we run away?
Cheers.
We never did cheers.
Cheers. We didn't.
Yes. So Chris, thanks so much for coming on. We would definitely will have you on again at some point. At the very least,
pleasure. The
3 of us will get together and drink some whiskey or talk fast or anything, whatever. I guess Prateek, then it goes to you. Is there anything you'd like to say to wrap us up?
It was great having Chris on because I just like Dan did not really understand Wardley maps really well, and I'm glad that you put it in a context that makes a little more sense, at least to me. And that's thanks for that. Yeah.
I said I was a world expert. Remember, I'd seen 2 presentations on it. World expert. The thing that fascinated me about his presentation is I think he got through 200 slides in like 45 minutes or something. Yeah. It was just insane. Okay, for the birthday girl, Nisha, happy birthday. Hopefully
happy birthday.
She can't get hi, sweetie. she can't get everything she wants. I'm sorry, Nisha, you can't choose your owner. You can't. I'm sorry.
she's got a little birthday cake waiting for her later. Yeah.
So for Nisha, for Chris, for Prateek, my name is Daniel Vacanti. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you in the next episode. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.